Hey everybody, I'm wanting to talk to y'all today about Boss's chapters 4 and 5. And she talks again about being resilient and coping and adapting. And one of the things she talks about in there is in chapter 4 is the difference in coping and managing. And I really haven't thought about that really about a difference in that, but she said that that managing is the positive outcome of coping. So I guess when, we can cope emotionally with a loss or a crisis or stressor, but then when we actually are able to manage our lives, then that's managing. So I kind of think of coping as more emotional and then managing as the physical manifestation of that coping. Um, and she talks also about the difference in individuals versus family. And definitely, in families, I'm sure you all have experienced that in your own families, is that there's one person who is a really strong person who just seems to get through anything, and they're kind of the rock or the pillar for the family. And then, sometimes families don't cope so well or manage so well. And so, but there seems to be that one person, or, different people manage in different ways. And of course, often I think sometimes the person who manages or copes or appears to cope so well is maybe the one who might actually be one of the most vulnerable ones. They just think that they have to be stoic, but inside maybe they're falling apart. Um, and in that case, a lot of times that's what makes people sick. They get sick when they hold it in like that, and they have this appearance of being very stoic. And I'm not saying that that's always across the board. Sometimes people look like they're strong and they really are, but I think sometimes it's kind of maybe an act, if you will. Um, and that's really kind of all I got out of chapter 4. It wasn't really a whole lot different from what we've talked about already. I kind of hate to say that, but we've talked about the inherited uh, coping strategies or features that sometimes, I don't know if it's really inherited, but it's what you pick up from the way your family manages. And maybe some of it is genetic. Maybe our genetic makeup has something to do with the way that we're able to manage in a stressful crisis situation. And she talks, and I think we talked about this before, maybe in Walsh's, but the chain reaction of stressor events, how, one thing might not be so stressful, but when you've got a lot of things built up, then sometimes, something that, let's say, if you're under a lot of stress and you go to the grocery store and the person in the checkout, or you go take something back to return it, and the person isn't, real willing to take your thing back or whatever. Normally, it wouldn't be a big deal, but let's say you just, had an argument at home, or you just got a bill for $1,000 that you don't have money to pay or whatever. Then, when you get to the store and somebody's not nice to you, then that's, gonna maybe set you off a little bit easier than it would, if things were going great. So anyway, so that's kind of the buildup of stressors. Then in chapter 5, Boss talks about boundary ambiguity, and we have talked about that before. We've talked about ambiguous loss, where if someone, the story or the example I use is a lot is, let's say 9/11, when somebody, was killed or presumed dead, but they never found their body. Then, you can only presume that they're dead, but until, normally we want to see a body, or we want to have some proof. And if we don't have that, then there's still some thought maybe in our mind that maybe they aren't dead. And that reminds me, I had a good friend back many years ago when we were kids, and his dad was an Air Force pilot, and his plane was lost in Alaska many years ago. It would have been in the 60s, and they never found his body. And so when this guy, I think he was 8 or 9 when that happened, when he was 17, 18 years old, he still had this thought that his father was going to come back, that he really wasn't dead because they never found his body. So that's just an example. And it can be, here's this kid, this now 17, 18-year-old kid who'd lived his, the last 10 years of his life waiting for his dad to walk in the door. So, that really had to affect him emotionally on a very deep level, and probably affected the way that he was in relationships with others. Um, really sad. So that is one, and then another is, let's say if somebody has Alzheimer's, or Alzheimer's is a good example where they're in body, but they're not there emotionally. They're basically lights on, but nobody's home. And I don't mean to sound crass when I say that, but it's kind of true. They're there, and their eyes are open, but there's really, in advanced stages, there's not really any brain stuff going on there. They've lost their memory. So, when does the grieving start? Is it when they get the diagnosis? I think the grieving starts when they get the diagnosis, because, they don't know how much longer they're going to have. They don't know what their life's going to look like. Their family members start grieving because they know that this is, where their life's going. And so, but, when so and there I've got a story about that. I have a friend whose husband was had Alzheimer's, and she kept hanging on to that he was still there, and of course talked to him as if he were, but he really wasn't. She really had a hard time letting go of that it wasn't the same person that she married. Again, a very sad situation. I understand. I would have had a hard time too. Um, so let's see what else on that. Well, another example of that, and something that we see a lot these days, is when kids, let's say a child's parents divorce, or maybe they weren't ever married, and they don't, maybe the child, let's say the father, for example, because normally up to now that's the way it's been, where the mother has the child, and then the father isn't there in the home. And so, is he still my dad, or is he not my dad? Because my mom won't let me see him, and he doesn't call me, but I know he's out there somewhere, but I don't see him or hear from him. And so that's, a little ambiguous. And so, what she says, boss, is her statement is, boundary ambiguity is who's out and who's in. So it's ambiguous sometimes because we don't know who's actually in the family. So, and that happens, I'd say, quite often with families, is where um, you're not sure who's out or who's in the family, especially in situations like that where there are perhaps even multiple children with different fathers, and who's the dad, or even, let's say somebody gets remarried, the parents divorce, and then the mom gets remarried, and so here's this new person who wants me to call him dad. He's not my dad. And so that's ambiguous, and it's some boundary issues, because maybe the stepfather wants to be the dad, but the kid says, no, you're not my dad. And so that's also boundary ambiguity. She talks on page 100 in the book about different things that can cause this boundary ambiguity. War, natural disasters, we've talked about that. Like tsunami is another one, thousands of people killed, and a lot of times many of them weren't ever found. Kidnapping, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. Let's say, look at this baby Lisa all in the news now, this 10-month-old baby who's gone. Is she dead, or is she alive? And do we grieve because she could be dead, or do we still hang on to hopes that she's still alive? And so, how are her parents? I know that they're trying to point fingers at the mom, but regardless, this is a loss. But let's say the mother's not guilty, and she doesn't know what happened to her child. Here, she doesn't know whether she should be grieving the death of a child, or still holding on to hope. And so that's pretty ambiguous, I would think. And of course, she wants to hang on to hope. And so then, if they don't find a body, where then does she start, really the grieving process? Or does she then always hang on to the hope that her child's going to come home? And you hear stories like that all the time, that not all the time, but there was a story like that yesterday. A guy was gone for 34 years and came back, or they found him. Then there are, more normal, there are some normal things in life that happen that cause ambiguous loss. But let's say when your child goes off to college, or when y'all, went off to college, your parents, are you in or are you out? You've gone away to college, but then you go back home, you're 21, maybe you go back home and your mom's still like, well, when are you going to be home? Where are you going? What are you doing? And you're like, oh, well, I'm 21 and I'm an adult. Well, so the mom's having some ambiguity here of, she wants to still be your mom, but you're an adult, so what's your position in the family? And so that's a kind of a normal thing. Also with elderly, moving to a nursing home. Doing that right now with my parents. We're talking about getting them in a retirement home, and so things are going to change. My mother's been cooking 2 days a week. She's 87 years old, for the family. I'll come 2 days a week to my parents' house. Well, she's not going to be able to do that anymore when she moves to retirement home. And so that's going to change things. So who's now going to be that person who does those things in the family? Probably be me. But so those are normal things that happen. But then for a while, it's, some adjustment. I know it's very stressful for them, my parents, to give up their position. And they're not really giving up their position, but they're changing their position in the family because they're now becoming more, my brother and sister and I are now becoming their caretakers, and they're not able to care for the family like they did. So it's ambiguous for all of us because now we're trying to figure out, okay, how does this all shake out? It can be very stressful because I'm stressed out because of them, because I don't know, what they're thinking, and just trying to figure out things and logistics and all that. So it's very stressful. Um, so boundary ambiguity occurs. She asked, when does it occur? It occurs a lot of times in life and throughout life. Um, Another one I see here, formation of a couple. That's a big one too. When people get married, it's like, okay, so this happens a lot where couples, now it happens a lot with guys. Um, well, it probably happens with girls too and their dad, but guys and their mom, and the mom's been the main woman in this guy's life. And so now he's married and she has to defer, if she's smart, she defers to the guy's wife because now she's the wife. And so things change and the boundaries change. And so the mother or mother-in-law has to be pretty careful about how she navigates those boundaries, or she should be. And the same goes for the dad and the daughter. A lot of times dads are very protective and they want their daughters' husbands to, take care of their daughters. And so they sometimes get across the boundaries a little bit there with making sure their daughters taken care of. Birth of a child, that's a big one. Boundaries when a couple are married and all of a sudden, and it's just them, and all of a sudden they've added another person to their family, and the mom normally, not always, but the mom usually is the one who does most of the caretaking. That's historically speaking. Um, and so then the dad kind of feels sometimes pushed out, and so he's kind of lost his position a little bit. And so that's another time that's very stressful in the life of families where you have some changes in the boundary lines, and it takes some adjustment. When kids first go to school, that's a big one. When moms go back to work, or dads, if they've been staying home and they go back to work. Um, Sometimes parents travel, or if you're a couple and you don't have kids, but the husband travels, then, when he's home,